There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or a shared cup of coffee, or a door left slightly ajar. You don't recognize them as turning points at the time. They are simply minutes, unfolding as all minutes do. It's only later, when you trace the map of your own heart, that you find the pin marking the precise location where the landscape changed forever. For me, that landscape was redrawn by a 2-inch gap in a doorway, a sliver of hallway light that fell across my floor like a question I was too terrified to answer. It was the first night Liam stayed in my spare room, and the silence in my apartment was louder than any sound I had ever known. A silence filled with the thunder of my own pulse and the weight of a single, unspoken hope that he was on the other side of that door, feeling even a fraction of the same seismic shift that was rearranging the entire world inside of me. We had met on a sweltering Saturday in July, the kind of day where the air itself feels heavy and sticky, a thick blanket you have to push through. Our mutual friend, Sarah, was moving into a 4th-floor walk-up, a cruel joke of an apartment for anyone with more possessions than a single suitcase. I was there because I'm the friend with a reliable car and an inability to say no. Liam was there, I learned later, for much the same reason. I saw him first from across the chaotic landscape of cardboard boxes and disassembled furniture. He was wrestling with a bookshelf that seemed to have been constructed from solid lead, his t-shirt already soaked through and clinging to the lines of his back. There was an easy competence in his movements, a fluid strength that was captivating to watch. He wasn't just lifting. He was solving the physical puzzle of the object, finding its center of gravity, leveraging his weight against its awkwardness. Even in the midst of that sweaty, undignified labor, there was a grace to him. I was a photographer, a quiet observer by trade and by nature. My life was lived through a lens, framing moments, looking for the light, for the story hidden in the mundane. And Liam, from that very first moment, was a story I wanted to read. He had a laugh that started in his chest and seemed to fill whatever space he was in, a warm, rumbling sound that made you want to laugh with him, even if you hadn't heard the joke. His hair was a perpetually messy thatch of dark brown, and when he pushed it back from his forehead, he had this habit of leaving a smudge of dirt or dust on his skin without realizing it. I found the detail inexplicably endearing. While I was carefully cataloging these things, he turned and caught me staring. I expected a flicker of annoyance or confusion. Instead, he just grinned, a wide, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You gonna stand there composing a shot, or are you gonna help me with this beast?" he'd called out, his voice friendly and teasing. The heat that rose in my cheeks had nothing to do with the summer humidity. That day unfolded in a rhythm of shared effort. We developed a silent language of teamwork, a shorthand of head nods and grunts as we navigated the treacherous stairwell. We discovered a shared, almost telepathic understanding of spatial dynamics, anticipating each other's moves as we angled a sofa through a too narrow doorway. During a break, sitting on the floor of the half-empty apartment and sharing a lukewarm bottle of water, we actually talked. He was a software engineer, he told me, a job that seemed at odds with the physical, grounded presence he exuded. He spoke about code with a surprising passion, describing it not as a series of commands, but as a form of architecture, building invisible structures that people could live and work inside. I told him about my photography, about my fascination with liminal spaces, doorways, empty hallways, the moment just before dawn. He listened with an intensity that was rare, his eyes fixed on mine, asking questions that showed he was actually hearing me, not just waiting for his turn to speak. He didn't just ask what I photographed, he asked why. By the time the last box was hauled up and Sarah had ordered celebratory pizzas, something had settled between us. It wasn't friendship yet, it was the foundation of one, a subtle recognition that we operated on a similar frequency. We sat on the floor, exhausted and grimy, leaning against the wall, our shoulders occasionally brushing. Each point of contact was a small spark against the backdrop of my quiet, internal world. I was hyper-aware of his proximity, of the heat radiating from his arm, of the way his breathing deepened when he laughed at one of Sarah's jokes. I had spent years building careful walls around my heart, constructing a safe, well-lit space where I was in control. It was a lonely kind of safety, but it was predictable. Liam, with his easy laugh and his unguarded warmth, felt like a wrecking ball wearing a friendly smile. Our friendship grew from that day, organically and without effort, like a vine finding its way toward the sun. It was a friendship built in the small, in-between moments. Late-night texts with links to ridiculously bad science fiction movies. Shared discoveries of hole-in-the-wall restaurants that serve the best pho or the greasiest, most perfect burgers. Long, meandering hikes on trails that wound through forests just outside the city, where the silence was comfortable and the conversation, when it came, was easy and unforced. He was the extroverted counterpoint to my introverted nature. He drew me out of my shell, out of the quiet solitude of my darkroom and my own head, while I seemed to offer him a space of calm, a harbor from the relentless energy of his social life and demanding job. He had a long-term girlfriend, Jessica, a kind and intelligent woman whom I liked. Their relationship was a settled fact, a permanent feature of the landscape I was navigating. It was also the primary buttress of the walls I kept so carefully maintained around my own feelings. My affection for Liam was cataloged and filed away under the heading of platonic. It was a secret I kept even from myself sometimes, a low, steady hum beneath the surface of our interactions, a warmth I cherished but never, ever examined too closely. To look at it directly would be to give it a name, and to give it a name would be to give it power. The power to ruin the most important friendship I had. So I observed. I documented. I framed him in the lens of my mind. I learned the cartography of his moods. I knew the subtle downturn of his mouth that meant a project at work was frustrating him. I knew the specific, bright glint in his eyes that appeared when he was about to tell a particularly terrible pun. I knew that he tapped his fingers on his thigh when he was thinking, a silent, rhythmic drumming that I found strangely soothing. He, in turn, seemed to understand my need for quiet. He never pushed me to talk when I was withdrawn. He would simply be present, a steady, reassuring weight in the room, until I was ready to emerge. We were a study in contrast that somehow found a perfect, complementary balance. He was the sun, and I was the cool shadow that offered respite. Our friendship was a delicate ecosystem, and I was its devoted, cautious warden. I would do anything to protect it, especially from myself. The shift began subtly, not with a bang, but with a slow, almost imperceptible change in the atmospheric pressure between us. It started when things with Jessica began to unravel. There was no dramatic fight, no single act of betrayal. It was, from what Liam told me in quiet, fragmented conversations, a simple, sad erosion. A slow drifting apart of two continents that had once been fused together. They had been together since college, and their lives had grown on parallel tracks that they had both assumed would eventually merge. Instead, they had just continued onward, parallel but separate, the distance between them widening so gradually that they didn't notice until it had become a chasm. He spoke of it with a kind of weary confusion, not the sharp pain of heartbreak, but the dull, aching disorientation of a man who realizes the map he's been following is hopelessly out of date. It's not that I don't love her, he told me one night, staring into a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking. We were in my apartment, the only light coming from the lamp on my desk, casting long shadows across the room. I do. But I think we love the idea of each other. The memory. We're ghosts in a house we built together, just going through the motions. That conversation was a turning point. It was the first time he had been truly, deeply vulnerable with me about his relationship. He wasn't looking for advice, just a place to let the words hang in the air without judgment. I listened, my role as the quiet observer more important than ever. I was a container for his uncertainty, a silent witness to his quiet grief. A part of me, a selfish, hopeful part that I immediately suppressed, felt a flicker of something terrible and bright. But it was overshadowed by a genuine ache for my friend's pain. To see him so unmoored was like watching a great, sturdy tree start to shed its leaves out of season. He, who had always seemed so certain, so grounded, was now adrift. After they officially broke up, that sense of being adrift intensified. He started spending more and more time at my place. It wasn't a conscious decision, more of a gravitational pull. His own apartment, the one he had shared with Jessica, was, he said, full of echoes. Mine was quiet. It was neutral territory. It was safe. He would show up at my door after work, looking tired and drained, the usual light in his eyes dimmed to a low ember. He wouldn't always want to talk. Sometimes he would just sink into my worn armchair, put on a record, and close his eyes, letting the music wash over him. I would continue with my work, editing photos on my computer, the soft clicks of my mouse a quiet counterpoint to the vinyl's gentle crackle. His presence was a solid, comforting thing in the room, even when it was saturated with his melancholy. I became acutely aware that I was becoming his anchor. I was the fixed point in his turbulent sea. It was a role I accepted without question, because what else could I do? He was my best friend, and he was hurting. The careful boundaries I had maintained began to blur, not because I was pushing them, but because he was leaning on them, and they were starting to give way under the weight of his need. The platonic filing system in my mind was in disarray. The folders were spilling their contents. The labels were peeling off. The low hum of my affection was growing louder, becoming a melody I could no longer ignore. And it terrified me, because I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that his turning to me was born of loneliness and loss. I was a port in a storm, and ports, by their very nature, are places people eventually leave. The ritual began on a Tuesday. It was raining, a relentless, miserable downpour that had been going on for days, turning the city into a gray, blurry watercolor. Liam had come over for dinner, a silent offering of takeout and shared company. We ate and then migrated to the couch to watch one of our stupid sci-fi movies, a comfortable pattern we had established long ago. But this time, the comfortable silence was laced with a new tension. He was quieter than usual, his gaze distant. Halfway through the movie, his head, which had been resting on the back of the sofa, slowly listed to the side until it came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. It was not the first time we had touched, of course. We'd bumped shoulders, shared hugs, slapped each other on the back. But this was different. This was an act of surrender. It was unconscious on his part. I could tell by the immediate deepening of his breath that he had fallen asleep. But for me, it was a cataclysmic event. I sat there, frozen, for what must have been an hour, every nerve in my body screamingly aware of the weight of his head, the warmth of his cheek through my t-shirt, the soft scent of his shampoo. I could feel the faint, rhythmic puff of his breath against my neck. My heart was a trapped bird, beating its wings against my ribs. I wanted to move, to gently shift him away, to restore the safe distance. But I also wanted to stay like that forever, to build a fortress around that single, fragile moment of contact. It was the sweetest agony I had ever known. When the movie ended and the credits rolled, casting a flickering white light across the dark room, I knew I had to do something. I gently shook his shoulder. "Liam," I whispered. He stirred, mumbling, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around, disoriented, before realizing where he was. A faint blush crept up his neck as he straightened up, pulling away from me. "Sorry," he mumbled, running a hand through his already messy hair. "I must have crashed. It's okay," I said, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. "You were exhausted." He looked at the window, where the rain was still lashing against the glass. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I don't think I have it in me to drive home in this." He paused, and then he looked at me, his expression hesitant, vulnerable. Would it be okay if I just crashed here? On the couch. It was the first time he had ever asked. And in that question, the foundation of our friendship trembled. I was supposed to be the friend, the safe harbor. But the word yes felt like a confession. Still, the word no was impossible. "Don't be an idiot," I said, forcing a casual tone. "The couch is terrible. You can take the spare room." And so the ritual was born. That first night, I gave him a set of clean towels and a new toothbrush I kept for guests. I showed him to the small, simple room at the end of the hall, the one I mostly used for storage but kept a comfortable bed in. Let me know if you need anything, I said, hovering awkwardly in the doorway. He just nodded, giving me a small, tired smile. Thanks, Leo. Really. I retreated to my own room, my own bed, but sleep was a distant country. I lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person breathing in my home. I was aware of him, of his presence on the other side of the wall, as if he were a low-frequency hum I could feel in my bones. The next time it happened, a few weeks later, the pretext was thinner. He'd had a long day at work, we'd had a couple of beers, and it was late. Easier than getting a cab, he'd said with a shrug, and I'd nodded, pretending it was just a matter of logistics. The couch was not even mentioned. He went straight to the spare room as if it were his own. And this time, he left the door open. Not wide open, but ajar. Just a few inches. Enough for a blade of light from the hallway to slice across the wooden floor. I lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The open door was a symbol, a piece of architecture freighted with meaning. Was it an accident? A careless oversight? Or was it an invitation? A signal? It was a perfect act of plausible deniability. If I said nothing, it meant nothing. If I were to ask about it, I would be the one imbuing it with significance, revealing my own hand, my own desperate hope. It was a question asked in the language of space and light, and I had no idea how to answer it. My entire existence became focused on that sliver of light. It was a connection, a fragile thread spun between our two separate rooms, our two separate solitudes. It felt intensely, terrifyingly intimate. This became the new pattern. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would end up at my apartment. He would find a reason, work stress, exhaustion, not wanting to be in his own empty place. And each time, he would retreat to the spare room, and each time, the door would be left slightly ajar. I began to live for those nights and to dread them in equal measure. The comfort of his presence was intoxicating, a balm for a loneliness I hadn't even realized was so profound. But the anxiety was a sharp, constant companion. I was living on a knife's edge of ambiguity, analyzing every gesture, every word, every silence, searching for a clue, a confirmation, a sign that I wasn't just projecting my own yearning onto him. During the day, our friendship was unchanged. We still hiked, still talked about movies, still laughed at the same stupid jokes. But at night, my apartment transformed. It became a theater of unspoken things, a charged space where the air crackled with possibility. The hallway between our rooms was a liminal space, a no-man's land of hope and fear. I would lie awake, listening for the sound of his footsteps, for the creak of the floorboards, for any sign that he might cross that threshold. He never did, and I, paralyzed by the fear of misreading everything and shattering the most precious thing I had, never crossed it either. We were two people in separate rooms, connected by a silent question that hung in the air between us, night after night after night. I was living in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a signal that might never come, slowly drowning in the beautiful, terrible hope of it all. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday in October, the air outside carrying the first real chill of autumn. The world felt muted and soft, wrapped in a blanket of gray mist. Liam had been unusually quiet all evening. He seemed to be carrying a weight that even our comfortable routine couldn't alleviate. He picked at his food, his gaze drifting to the rain-streaked window, lost in some internal landscape I couldn't access. The usual easy banter was absent, replaced by a silence that felt heavier, more fragile than usual. I didn't push. I had learned that his silences were like fallow fields. They needed to be left alone to do their work. After dinner, instead of migrating to the couch, I found myself drawn to my darkroom. It was my sanctuary, the one place in the world where I felt completely in control. The smell of fixer and stop bath was as comforting to me as the scent of baking bread might be to someone else. It was the smell of creation, of alchemy, of turning light and shadow into something tangible. I was working on a series of prints from our last hiking trip, images of fog-shrouded trees and quiet, empty paths. Liam followed me, leaning against the doorframe, watching me work under the eerie, crimson glow of the safe light. The red light stripped away all artifice, painting our faces in monochrome, deepening the shadows under our eyes, making the space feel secret and sacred, like a confession booth. I moved with practiced efficiency, my hands gliding through the chemical trays, clipping a print to the line to dry. The only sounds were the gentle sloshing of the liquid and the soft drip of water. Liam didn't speak for a long time. He just watched, his presence a solid, silent weight in the small room. The tension was a physical thing, a third entity in the room with us. It was in the way he held himself, in the way my own hands trembled almost imperceptibly as I worked. I was intensely aware of him, of the inches that separated us. The silence stretched, pulled taut between us, until I thought it might snap. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low it was almost lost in the quiet hum of the room. "You make it look so easy." I looked up from the tray, my eyes having adjusted to the dim red light. I could see the faint outline of his face, his expression unreadable. "It's not easy," I said. "It's just a process. You follow the steps. You trust the chemistry, trust the chemistry." He repeated, the words soft and thoughtful. He pushed off from the doorframe and took a step into the room, then another, until he was standing beside me, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him. He looked at the print hanging on the line, an image of a lone path disappearing into a thick bank of fog. "What happens if you get a step wrong?" "You can ruin the image," I answered, my voice a little breathless. "Overexpose it. Underdevelop it. Lose it completely." My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I felt like one of my own photographs, submerged in a developing solution, waiting to see what image would emerge from the ether. He was quiet for another long moment, his gaze shifting from the photograph to me. In the strange, bloody light of the darkroom, his eyes seemed almost black, deep and unreadable. The air was thick with everything we had never said, with months of unspoken questions and shared, ambiguous nights. The ritual of the open door, the head on my shoulder, the quiet companionship, it all led to this single, unbearable point of pressure. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not just loneliness or confusion in his eyes, but something else. Something that mirrored the frantic hope in my own chest. It was fear, yes, but it was also a profound, undisguised yearning. "Leo," he began, his voice barely a whisper. He swallowed, and I watched the motion of his throat in the dim light. "Would it be weird? Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The gentle sloshing of the chemicals, the dripping of the water, the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. It all faded away into a profound silence. His question was not one of passion or demand. It was tentative, fragile, laced with a vulnerability so raw it felt like a wound. He was giving me all the power, offering me the choice to preserve the status quo, to pretend the question was never asked, to retreat back to the safety of our carefully constructed friendship. He was offering me an escape hatch, and in that moment, I knew I didn't want it. I had spent years living in the safety of observation, of emotional distance. But safety was just another word for loneliness. I couldn't find my voice. The words were trapped somewhere in my throat, tangled in the knot of fear and elation. So I just nodded, a small, jerky movement that felt like the most significant gesture of my entire life. He seemed to deflate with a quiet rush of air, a release of tension that I felt as much as I saw. He closed the small distance between us, his hand coming up to gently cup my jaw. His skin was warm, his thumb stroking softly against my cheek. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his eyes searching mine, giving me one last chance to pull away. I didn't. I leaned into his touch, a silent answer to his silent question. And then he kissed me. It was not like any kiss I had ever imagined. It was impossibly soft, tentative, a gentle press of lips that tasted of uncertainty and a deep, aching sadness. It was a question, not an answer. A confession, not a declaration. It was the culmination of 1,000 unspoken moments, a quiet, seismic event in the deep, red twilight of my darkroom. And in that moment, everything I had been so terrified of losing felt insignificant compared to what I had just found. The aftermath was a landscape of deafening silence. The kiss ended as gently as it began, a soft exhalation of breath that seemed to carry all the weight of the months leading up to it. We stood there in the crimson glow, not touching, the space between us charged with a new, terrifying fragility. I didn't know what to say. The rulebook for our friendship had been incinerated in that single moment of contact, and we were left standing in the ashes, with no map for this new territory. Liam wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the developing tray as if it held the secrets of the universe, his jaw tight. The vulnerability that had been so raw in his face just moments before was gone, replaced by a shuttered, distant expression. "I should go," he finally said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion that had saturated his earlier question. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the darkroom, his footsteps echoing softly down the hall. I heard the front door open and click shut, and then there was only the sound of the rain and the frantic, chaotic beating of my own heart. I stood frozen in the red light, my fingers tingling where his hand had been on my face, the ghost of his lips still warm on mine. I felt suspended between two opposing poles, a soaring, incandescent hope and a plummeting, gut-wrenching dread. I had crossed a threshold, and I had no idea if he had crossed it with me, or if I was now standing there utterly, irrevocably alone. The next morning, the silence in my apartment was a heavy, suffocating thing. The spare room bed was neatly made, the towel folded. There was no sign he had ever been there, except for the coffee mug in the sink and the gaping hole in the fabric of my reality. I waited all day for a call, a text, anything. My phone felt like a dead weight in my pocket. I kept checking it, my stomach twisting into tighter knots with each passing hour of silence. I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar process of editing, but the images on my screen were just meaningless shapes of light and shadow. The only image I could see was his face in the darkroom, the raw need in his eyes just before he'd closed the distance between us. Finally, late in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from him. My heart leaped into my throat. I fumbled with the device, my hands shaking. The message was short, brutal in its simplicity. "Hey, sorry about last night. I was a mess. Shouldn't have done that." I read the words once, twice, a dozen times. Each reading was a fresh blow. A mess shouldn't have done that, he was erasing it. He was chalking it up to a moment of weakness, a symptom of his post-breakup confusion. He was recasting the most significant moment of my life as a mistake. The hope that had been a sunburst in my chest collapsed into a black hole of humiliation and pain. I had misinterpreted everything. Every open door, every shared silence, every moment of proximity. I had built a grand, beautiful cathedral of meaning out of a pile of random debris. He wasn't reaching for me. He was just flailing in his own grief, and I was simply the closest solid object to grab onto. The pain was sharp and specific, the unique agony of realizing you have been a fool. The quiet observer had seen only what he wanted to see. He avoided me for the next week. My texts went unanswered, my calls went straight to voicemail. The silence stretched into a canyon between us. The friendship I had been so desperate to protect was in ruins anyway, but not in the way I had feared. I hadn't destroyed it with a confession, he had destroyed it with his retraction. The quiet of my apartment, once a source of comfort, became an indictment. Every corner held a memory of him. The armchair he always sat in, the spot on the couch where his head had rested on my shoulder, the hallway that had once seemed so full of promise. It was all tainted now, haunted by the ghost of what I had allowed myself to believe was possible. The anger came slowly, a slow-burning fire that gradually replaced the cold shock of hurt. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for his inability to face what had happened between us. But mostly, I was angry at myself. Angry for being so passive, for living in the shadows of my own feelings, for allowing him to define the terms of our entire relationship with his ambiguity and his needs. I had been a silent witness, a container, a harbor. But I was a person, not a place. And I deserved more than a brief, apologetic text message. The quiet observer had to finally step out from behind the lens and into the frame. After 7 days of agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to his apartment. I had no plan, no speech prepared. I was operating on pure, undiluted nerve. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I walked up to his door. I almost turned back a dozen times. But the thought of returning to my silent, haunted apartment was worse than the fear of this confrontation. I knocked, my knuckles rapping against the wood with more force than I intended. It took him a long time to answer. When the door finally opened, he looked terrible. He was unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt I'd seen him in a week ago. He looked surprised to see me, and then a wave of something else, guilt, fear, washed over his face. He didn't invite me in. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, a human barrier. "Leo," he said, his voice rough. "We need to talk," I said, my own voice steadier than I felt. He sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't think that's a good idea. Too bad," I said, my anger finally finding its voice. "Because I'm not leaving until you talk to me. You don't get to do what you did and then just disappear. You don't get to kiss me like that and then send a text message like you're canceling a coffee date. I deserve more than that." He flinched at my words, but he didn't argue. He just stepped back, opening the door wider, a silent admission of defeat. I walked into his apartment. It was a mess. Clothes were draped over chairs. Takeout containers were stacked on the coffee table. It looked like a place where someone had given up. It was the physical manifestation of the echoes he had talked about. I turned to face him. He was standing by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. The silence in this room was different from the silence in mine. It was stale, heavy with neglect. "What do you want me to say, Leo?" he asked, his voice low. "The truth," I said, the word hanging in the air between us. "Whatever that is. If it was a mistake, if you regret it, then look me in the eye and tell me that. But don't you dare hide from me. Our friendship, whatever is left of it, deserves at least that much honesty." He stared at me for a long time, his expression a turbulent storm of conflicting emotions. I could see the struggle playing out across his face. And then, something in him seemed to break. His shoulders slumped, the defensive posture crumbling away. He sank onto the arm of his sofa, burying his face in his hands. His voice, when he finally spoke, was muffled and thick with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "That's the problem. It's the only thing that's felt real in months." He looked up at me, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "And it scares the hell out of me." The confession, when it came, was a torrent. He spoke of his confusion, of the profound loneliness that had settled over him like a shroud after Jessica left. He talked about how my apartment, my presence, had become the only place he felt safe, the only place the echoes in his own head quieted down. He admitted that leaving the door open had been intentional, a subconscious plea for connection that he was too cowardly to make with words. He said he hadn't understood what he was feeling, this deep, gravitational pull toward me, until that night in the darkroom. He'd looked at me, surrounded by the quiet magic of my work, and suddenly everything had clicked into focus with a terrifying clarity. "I kissed you because I had to," he said, his voice raw. "It felt like I couldn't breathe until I did. And the second it was over, I panicked. Because it felt right. It felt more right than anything has felt in years. And I have no idea what to do with that. I've spent my whole life on one road, Leo. I knew what the map looked like. And now, I'm in a country I don't recognize, and I don't know the language." He was afraid. Afraid of what this meant, afraid of what other people would think, afraid of his own feelings. He had run not because the kiss meant nothing, but because it meant everything. And in his fear, he had hurt me and himself. All the anger drained out of me, replaced by a deep, aching wave of empathy. He wasn't a coward. He was just lost, and he had been trying to find his way in the dark. I crossed the room and sat on the coffee table in front of him. I didn't touch him. I just waited until he met my eyes again. "So you're lost," I said softly. "It's okay. So am I. Maybe we can be lost together for a while. Maybe we can figure out the map as we go." A single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers found mine, lacing through them. His grip was tight, desperate. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I hurt you." "I know," I said. And I did. In that moment, sitting in the wreckage of his apartment, holding his hand, I understood everything. The fear, the confusion, the running. It wasn't a rejection of me. It was a terrified reaction to the overwhelming, unexpected rightness of us. The storm had finally broken, and in its wake, the air was clear and still, and we could finally begin to breathe again. That conversation was the foundation for our new world. We talked for hours, sitting in the mess of his living room as the afternoon light faded into the deep blue of evening. We unraveled the tangled threads of the past few months, laying them out one by one, examining them in the clear, honest light of confession. There were no more shadows, no more ambiguity. We spoke of my long-hidden feelings, the quiet affection I had nurtured in secret for years. I told him about the agony of his plausible deniability, the nightly torture of the open door, the way my heart had learned to live in a state of suspended hope. He listened without interrupting, his thumb stroking the back of my hand, his eyes filled with a sad, gentle regret for the pain his own confusion had caused. He, in turn, spoke of the slow, creeping loneliness that had defined his life for so long, even before his relationship with Jessica had ended. He described a feeling of being disconnected, of playing a role he thought he was supposed to play, only to realize he had forgotten who he actually was. Being with me, he said, was like coming home to a place he didn't know he was searching for. It was quiet and real, and it allowed him to be himself without pretense. The physical comfort he sought was just a manifestation of a much deeper emotional need, a need to be anchored, to be seen. And in his fear of that profound connection, he had almost destroyed it. There was a profound sense of relief in that honesty. It was like lancing a wound, painful but necessary, allowing the healing to finally begin. We didn't solve everything that day. We didn't define what we were or map out a plan for the future. We simply agreed to stop being afraid. We agreed to face this new, uncharted territory together, one step at a time. The goal wasn't a destination. It was the act of walking the path side by side. It was enough. It was more than enough. When we finally fell silent, exhausted and emotionally drained, the room was dark. I stood up. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's get out of here." He didn't ask where we were going. He just nodded, his hand still holding tight to mine. We left his apartment, with its stale air and its echoes of a life that was over, and drove back to my place. My apartment felt different when we walked in. The ghosts were gone. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken tension. It was light, peaceful, filled with a quiet sense of promise. We didn't talk much. We moved around the familiar space in a comfortable, synchronous orbit. He helped me make a simple dinner of scrambled eggs and toast. We ate sitting at my small kitchen table, the only sound the soft scrape of forks on plates. It was the most intimate meal of my life. Later, when it was time for bed, there was a moment of quiet hesitation. We stood in the hallway, the same hallway that had once been a chasm of ambiguity between us. He looked at the spare room, then he looked at me. The question was there in his eyes, but this time it wasn't clouded by fear. It was clear and open. I didn't answer with words. I just held out my hand. He took it, and I led him past the spare room, past that open door that had caused so much silent turmoil, and into my room. That night, we slept. Just slept. He was on one side of the bed. I was on the other, a small, respectful distance between us. But the walls were gone. The real ones and the metaphorical ones. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to find that the distance had closed. He had shifted in his sleep, his arm draped over my waist, his face buried in my shoulder, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against my neck. It was the same position he had fallen into on the couch all those months ago, the act that had started this whole slow, painful, beautiful cascade of events. But this time, it was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was a choice. My own arm came up to rest on his, and I held him there, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the solid, comforting weight of his presence. There was no anxiety, no frantic analysis. There was only a profound, bone-deep sense of peace. I had found my harbor, and this time, I knew it wasn't just a temporary port in a storm. It was home. The days that followed were a process of quiet discovery. We were learning a new language together, a language of intentional intimacy. The small gestures that had once been so fraught with meaning were now simple, uncomplicated expressions of affection. A hand on the small of my back as we passed in the kitchen. The way he would find my foot with his under the table. The easy, unthinking way he would reach for my hand when we walked down the street. Each touch was a reaffirmation, a quiet statement that the honesty we'd found in his wrecked living room was real and lasting. He started the slow process of disentangling his life, of packing up the apartment he had shared with Jessica, of building a new one for himself. But more often than not, he was at mine. My home, once my solitary sanctuary, reshaped itself to accommodate him. His toothbrush appeared in the holder next to mine. A few of his books found their way onto my shelves. His favorite coffee mug became a permanent fixture on the drying rack. These were not grand gestures, but small, domestic invasions that felt like the most romantic acts in the world. They were symbols of permanence, of two separate lives beginning to weave themselves together into a single, stronger fabric. One afternoon, I found him standing in my darkroom, not in the dim red glow of the safe light, but in the full, bright light of day. He was looking at the print that had been hanging on the line that night, the foggy, solitary path. He touched the edge of the paper gently. "I used to think that was the saddest picture," he said without turning around. "Just this empty road going nowhere." He turned to face me, a small, soft smile on his face. But I was wrong. It's not about being lost. It's about the journey. It's about not knowing what's around the next bend and deciding to walk it anyway. He was no longer just the unknowing initiator, the restless force that had upset the quiet order of my life. He was a partner, an explorer navigating this new world with a courage that humbled me. And I was no longer just the quiet observer, framing life from a safe distance. I was in the picture now, my feet firmly on that path beside him, walking into the fog without fear, because I was no longer walking it alone. The camera, for so long my shield and my interpreter, became a tool to document our shared joy. I took pictures of him sleeping in my bed, the morning light soft on his face. I took pictures of him laughing so hard, he cried while we watched another terrible movie. I took pictures of our hands, intertwined on the table at a coffee shop. I was no longer just capturing liminal spaces. I was capturing a life being lived, a home being built. We never had a grand conversation where we put a label on what we were. We didn't need to. Our definition was written in the quiet moments. It was in the way he would bring me a cup of tea when I was lost in my work. It was in the way I knew exactly how he liked his eggs. It was in the comfortable silences that now filled my apartment, silences that were no longer about what was unsaid, but about what didn't need to be said at all. The peace we found was not a dramatic, cinematic peace. It was a quiet, sturdy, everyday kind of peace. The kind you can build a life on. And the door to the spare room? It stayed closed now, not as a barrier, but as a simple fact. The room was just a room again. All the meaning, all the hope and anxiety I had poured into that empty space had found its proper home. It was no longer trapped in the architecture of my apartment. It was living and breathing in the space between us. Some moments in life are loud and declarative, their significance announced with trumpets. But the most important ones, I think, are the whispers. They are the doors left ajar, the hesitant questions asked in the dark, the quiet choice to stay. They are the moments that, when pieced together, form not just a story, but a life. Our life began in the clutter of a friend's moving day, was tested in the crucible of fear and silence, and was finally, blessedly found in the beautiful, honest quiet we had learned to create together. We were just two people who had found our way out of the fog and into the light.